listening to The New Paris. I'm your host, Lindsay Tremuta. There are two things I love to consume in Paris. One of them is coffee. The other is chocolate. And yet I have never done an episode on this show about chocolate. I went back and looked through more than 100 episodes, and while chocolate gets a mention here and there, it has never gotten its due as the primary subject of a discussion. So I hope I will make up for that shortcoming with today's conversation. As you may know, chocolate isn't created equal, and French style is very different from, say, Belgian or Swiss. There are chocolate shops and pastry chefs who dabble in chocolate all over Paris, but within that network, there are clear differences in quality. Lisa Allen, a chocolate educator, pastry chef, and guide, joins me to talk about some of these distinctions, what she's learned from running tasting workshops, and where she recommends you go for all your chocolate needs in Paris. And by the way, if you're enjoying the show but aren't yet subscribed, hit that follow button wherever you're listening to be notified as soon as a new episode is released. Lisa, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Lisa, you told me some interesting stories about yourself, which is that you were in education.
Yes.
You taught for a very long time.
Yes.
You taught all over the world.
I did.
And then kind of a massive about face, and you went to pastry school at Ferrandi in Paris.
Yeah.
And that led you to the thing we all love, although I shouldn't say all. There are people who don't like chocolate, and I simply do not understand them, but into chocolate.
Yes.
Your love of chocolate predated that pastry training.
Yes. I'm pretty sure my love of chocolate started in the womb. I was always into chocolate and baking. I was always the one wanting to make birthday cakes and cookies for my friends. And when I was teaching overseas, I was making people cakes and treats. I even remember once calling in sick to work when I was teaching in Switzerland because I had in my head this cake that I wanted to make for a friend for her birthday, and I wasn't done. And so I literally stayed home from work to work on the cake.
Oh my gosh.
Hope nobody who I worked with at that time heard that. But it was actually in that time when I was living and working in Zurich. So that means around 2010 that I started experimenting with chocolate making myself, started tempering by hand. It was around that time that I started experimenting, making my own bonbons, making a lot of fillings, tempering by hand, creating shells. I remember bringing my first batch of handmade chocolates into my colleagues in Switzerland and trying to sort of weasel my way in to the kitchen at Honnold, which is this incredible, smaller Swiss chocolatier company up in Kuznach that I used to go to, and sort of buddied up with the chef to learn from him. And so then I consciously or unconsciously kept moving closer to the source, right? So then when I left Switzerland, my next teaching job was actually in Venezuela. And so it was there that over the course of those 2 years that I was in Venezuela, as people familiar with Latin American politics might remember, it was a very unstable time, 2014 to 16. And so as the zeitgeist was moving towards, I'm going to have to leave the country soon, I also started thinking about alternatives because it was a difficult post, to say the least. And so that's when I said, hey, I can take a break. And since I don't see a job opening in Paris, I'd always wanted to come to Paris. I don't see a job to teach in a school, but I could actually go as a student. And that was what gave me the idea to come and enroll in pastry school, kind of like a go hard or go home. If I'm going to study pastry, I might as well study the best pastry, which is, of course, French.
Agreed.
And if I want to study French pastry, I might as well go to Paris. And so in that time, as I was sort of preparing for this shift, which was supposed to just be a 1 to 2 year break from my teaching career, through a friend of a friend, I basically got connected to some cacao exporters who were managing what turned out to be some of the most highly respected cacao in the world at the time, Chihuahua. There are these family-run cooperative plantations that in order to get there, you've got to, drive an hour and a half to 2 hours, sometimes 4, depending on traffic or other issues, up and over the mountains to get to the coast, to stay at Chorani, to get in a tiny boat.
And that is where?
In Venezuela.
In Venezuela, okay.
Yeah, so you have to go from the Bay of Chorani in a little dinghy boat that you're not sure is going to make it anywhere. And you can only access, at the time, you could only really access these cacao plantations by basically by waters. Then you get to the cove of Chihuahua, and then you have to take another truck up through the jungle, and then you get to this clearing in front of this church, and you're in the little village of Chihuahua.
And that it's really to make sure you want to be there. You
Yeah.
really want to visit.
Yeah. And so I was just so lucky. I didn't realize how lucky I was to get invited on this trip, which was actually a sort of piggybacking on a sourcing trip for Dandelion chocolates.
Oh, I know them.
Yeah.
Yes, we talked about this in California, right?
In California. And I actually got to hang out with Greg, who was one of the original founders at the recent chocolate festival in Bordeaux. Still a super cool guy, still really involved in cacao and chocolate. And so I got to sort of piggyback and be a fly on the wall on this origin sourcing trip out to Chihuahua. And my friend Pat, who was the guy who was sort of running the fermentation and everything there, also really just has the magical touch with not just the farmers, but the plants and everything. And he just has a way with people that I now really appreciate as a super important part of the chain of how good chocolate and good cacao happens. And he is also an excellent teacher. And so while we're walking through the fields, he's picking these beautiful little white Criollo flowers and showing me with his pocket knife and explaining everything. And he had studied the agronomy, and he knew how to, really tease the best out of the plants and really work with the cacao in a lot of special ways to develop this fine flavor. And so what I didn't realize that I was getting this very special origin experience, understanding where chocolate really comes from, that usually people have to work 10, 15 years in the industry before they have a chance to go out to origin. And I started there. And so that experience really shaped and informed everything that I have done since when it comes to chocolate and cacao, because I was at the source from the beginning. And so I really understood how it's all connected in a way that I think, like a lot of
coffee farmers too, right? People in coffee.
Yeah, I met coffee. But what's coming to mind is that that moment in the film Madagascar, the animated film Madagascar, when the lion is hungry and he's dreaming of a steak, and because he's grown up in a zoo, when he dreams of a steak, what you see is this, like, the picture of a fabricated shape of a slice of a steak. And that's what he thinks of when he's hungry. And he doesn't realize that, like, the animals around him are meat.
Right.
Right? And so he doesn't connect the animal to the food.
I could argue that most of us are disconnected from where our food comes from.
Exactly.
And unfortunately for coffee and chocolate, they come from, when you live in America or in Europe, they come from very far away.
Right.
And so it's very hard to keep that connection alive in people's minds.
Right.
And you think of it as either a luxury or a commodity.
Right. And people think of, where does chocolate, and this is something that, when I do my family tours and chocolate tasting classes and stuff, when I first say to people, like, okay, when you think of good chocolate, where does good chocolate come from?
Ooh.
Their first answer is usually going to be like France or Belgium or Switzerland or Germany.
It's the finished product.
Right. And so they only think of chocolate as the finished product, and they have very little understanding, even the fact that chocolate comes from a fruit, right? The cacao is a fruit, that it's a plant that grows in the ground, just like your tomatoes, your carrots, your oranges from different parts around the world, that at the end of the day, it's an agricultural product. And if you start to really think about chocolate and understand it from that angle of, like, this is something being produced for me to eat, but it's coming from a plant being grown in a place far away. And you start thinking about, the chocolate that I like comes from Peru. It doesn't come from France, because it's the person in France who maybe transformed the bean. But in order to do that work, they had to find these great beans coming from a completely different part of the world.
Now, do you think that the average Parisian or French consumer of chocolate, who I would argue is more educated than Americans, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you probably grew up like me, where you talked about baking, right? You like baking cakes and cookies and these sorts of things. And, I would try my hand at baking brownies. Did it come from a box? Potentially. I was very disconnected from what chocolate was. Chocolate was Hershey's and Reese's Cups. And, as someone who has now become very demanding and exacting in what they're going to consume, it's a far cry from where I started.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely, when I first started baking when I was, 8 or 9 years old, it was definitely blueberry muffins from a box mix with a plastic packet of blueberries preserved in syrup.
Right.
You know.
And to clarify, the French have their own boxed brownie
They
and
do.
garbage gâteau au chocolat. So it's not that they don't have the same inclination toward convenience, but you have gift giving many times a year that involve chocolate, right? You see chocolate prominently on display, at least in a big city, but even in small towns.
Yeah, and I think part of it is really about, and this is something that I do end up talking about a lot with my American clients, is that, you know, in every culture, in every country, in every strata of society around the world, the balance of respect and prestige for different professions and different types of craftsmen or artisans is very different, of what people value societally, and which doesn't necessarily translate to like how much you get paid to do that job.
Right.
But like, for example, when I lived in Switzerland, local Swiss teachers, school teachers, you know, and I might be wrong at this, but I remember being shocked, like they get paid more than some doctors, right? Like education was considered super important and the teachers were really well paid. Whereas in the US, teaching is kind of a thankless profession and it's really generally poorly paid, right? So in France, gastronomy and food have a really, really high place on the chain of respect. And I feel like...
but they're not necessarily well paid.
But they're not necessarily well paid.
Unfortunately,
right.
But they're valued.
They're valued.
Just not in monetary, helpful terms.
Right. So, you know, you can have the most renowned Michelin-starred MOF pastry chef working at a Palace Hotel on the Champs-Élysées who's walking around like the king. And if people see him on the street, they fall all over him. Like, oh my God, it's that chef. You know, and it's like, he's got fame, but he's still not breaking more than 3,500 euros a month.
Right.
You know, and that's a top salary.
Yeah.
At least it was 10 years ago. So it's an interesting distinction to make. But that being said, French culture really, and again, this is something that I talk about a lot with my tour clients, there is a high respect for food, for eating, for the culinary arts as an art form, respecting the ingredients, respecting the techniques, respecting the fact that, you know, a croissant, which only has, 4 or 5 ingredients, there are so many subtleties in how well it tastes based on what kind of butter you're using, how are you treating the butter, what kind of flour you're using, how are you treating the flour. And it doesn't taste different because different chemicals are added and because different raising agents and accelerators are added, like what might happen in the US. But it's because they're being very respectful of the base ingredients being used and the techniques. And also the respect for eating as an important part of daily life.
Yeah.
Here in France, you sit down at the table, you drink your coffee from a real cup. You don't walk down the street with a paper cup of espresso sloshing around.
Not espresso, although the matcha...
Yeah, the matcha latte.
You know, you see it
It's
to a degree,
changing.
but it is still a sliver of what it is in the US.
Right.
And in also, I'm sure, in the UK and everywhere else.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that there's exposure to all of these things from such a young age.
There's exposure, but also a sense of respect, right? So like, and it's hard for me to ever do anything without talking about my daughter because I'm just so in love with her. But, you know, I remember being so impressed and almost shocked when, you know, my daughter started was in the French crèche, like a daycare.
Yep.
And by the time they're 2.5, when it's lunchtime, the kids are serving themselves and each other. They sit down at the table. They're using forks and knives. They're not allowed to use their hands to eat after a certain age. They bust their own tables, but they sit and have a meal together and they all eat the same food. And so it's the respect for this is a communal experience, and it's part of the respect for each other, respect for your own body, your own health. You sit down, you have a warm meal, right? You talk to people, you engage, and when it's done, you get up and the meal is over and you clean up and you put it away. Even the fact that, you know, all French schools have a kitchen and the kids eat a hot meal at lunch that has several courses. You know, there's none of this like, oh, bringing your paper bag with your PB&J and your apple and eating it in 20 minutes running from one class to the other, right? And so
Did you talk to my mother before this podcast?
No.
Because that's exactly, I had that lunch with Yoo-hoo. which is a faux
I remember Yoo-hoo.
chocolate. They had to call it a chocolate drink because
Back
they
then.
couldn't call it chocolate milk.
No, exactly.
So anyway, that like segued perfectly.
So, yeah. But like all of that, dancing around this idea that the French really respect food. They respect chocolate as an art form. They respect pastry as an art form. They respect the idea that taste and enjoyment of your food is a full all the senses experience. You have to appreciate the food. You have to anticipate it. You have to see that the visual aspect is very important. It's beautiful. It's clean. It's well organized. When you go to buy a chocolate or a pastry and you see that the respect and the care has been put into creating a beautifully presented product where all of the piping is even and there's no crumbs on the plate and there's no dust under the counter, like that is all part of the experience of this is an item to be respected and I will respect it as I bring it into my body, right? As I eat it. And so I think a lot of Americans coming to Paris, they'll always say, like even my friends who are visiting this week, they're like, I just can't get over how stylish everything is and how well dressed people are. And every restaurant we go into and every cafe, it's like a work of art. And it's like, well, yeah, it is.
But aesthetics
are important here.
Yeah, exactly.
Because aesthetics really do affect how you experience things. And if you want to fully appreciate and experience a culinary experience, the aesthetics are part of it. We do eat with our eyes. We do feel more comfortable in well-organized, calm spaces. We do feel that, and there have been lots of studies done about this, that the lighting, the size and weight of the fork that you're using, all of these things affect how you perceive how good something is as food.
Right.
Because all of those things affect how your brain is processing the information of what it tastes like.
Well, and also this goes back to the royal court and how they use some of these culinary arts and tablescaping and all of these aesthetic details as part of their soft power.
Right.
It's soft power and it's still happening today.
Yeah.
So would you say then that there is a noticeable difference between the chocolate that is most sold and enjoyed by the French versus Belgian style, now working with obviously the cacao from far-reaching places and then transforming it, as well as Switzerland? Because I always found one of the big questions is, well, what makes the chocolates sold in France so different? What are the chocolatiers doing different here than they do in neighboring countries?
So there's a lot of things, a lot of sort of classic, more obvious, and then some more subtle differences. Like, for example, the French really do tend to value dark chocolate much more highly. Mm-hmm. So most of the focus that chefs are putting into their chocolates or chocolatiers, if they're making a series of bonbons, it's mostly dark chocolate with a couple of milk thrown in there just to like appease the masses or to say like, oh, there's going to be the one person at the table who doesn't like dark chocolate. But they don't really put a lot of respect into it because they feel like the milk kind of disrupts the flavor. French chocolate tends to have a much deeper, more complex cacao flavor to it, whereas Belgian chocolate, and it's, as we were talking about before, the French concept of what chocolate should be is about elegance, about refinement. If you have a filled bonbon, the shell is nice and thin and crispy, whereas in Belgian-style chocolates, they classically are focusing on milk chocolates. It's about indulgence. It's about generosity. It's about like a kind of a big, heavy, like you feel like you ate a sweet treat.
Yeah.
Whereas in France, it's like, oh, I had a tasting of something well made. And so Belgian chocolates tend to have a lot more added cocoa butter to make that sort of smooth, creamy mouthfeel. They tend to have a lot more sugar.
Yeah.
A lot more of, a lot higher percentage of the chocolates in that box are going to be praliné based, where it's almost always the same blend of mostly, hazelnuts, milk chocolate, maybe almonds, but it's usually fairly smooth, whereas the French ones tend to be crunchier for the praliné. The pieces are bigger. They have like the little shell shapes, stuff like that. But it's much more about sweet, common indulgence in Belgium, whereas in France, it's really more about this is a tasting experience and you want to really taste the cacao. There's a lot less cocoa butter added here.
And as you were saying, that tends to be added to create that silky mouthfeel that is not naturally, that the pure cacao bean does not give you. when you transform it?
It depends, right? So, and this is something people don't realize, is that a cacao bean is naturally anywhere from 40 to 60% cacao butter to begin with. It has to be, right? That's what you're tempering. When you temper chocolate, that's the fat that balances out the cocoa solids. But depending on the bean itself, you can have more or less cocoa butter. And the more cocoa butter you have, the more fat, the silkier it is when you put it in your mouth, but that also means it's more fluid and easier to work with. So classically, couverture chocolate that like people would use to cover bonbons and that kind of thing, it needs to be smooth and fluid and easy to temper and easy to work with. And so it's always been a practice to add a little extra cocoa butter for chocolate that's going to be used in that way, right? Because you need that fluidity. A lot of origins, when you're dipping towards the lower end of cocoa butter content naturally occurring, those chocolates can be really hard to work with because they're hard to get through the machines. They tend to set really fast. They tend to be too thick to mold. You know, the amount of tapping you have to do to get the air bubbles out is just insane. And so, like, we were talking about dandelion earlier. Dandelion is 2-ingredient chocolate, and they don't add cocoa butter. And so I was doing a project last year, actually, where I was invited. I don't know if I told you about this before. One of these things that happened in my life. The French consulate in San Francisco invited me to come teach chocolate workshops and tasting introductions in French to the children in the French bilingual and immersion schools in the Bay Area.
Wow, that's so cool.
Thanks. Yeah, it was cool. So, and I got contacted as a Ferrandi alumni because right, because the French consulate contacted Ferrandi alumni office and said, we would like one of your alumni who can do this. Notably things like comfortable teaching in French, but also comfortable in English, doesn't need a fancy visa to go be in the U.S. and work for a bit, free to travel, willing to do this for, as a bénévole, as we say in French.
A volunteer.
A volunteer. Okay. And working in the field, but also with the flexibility to just fly to San Francisco for 10 days.
Sure.
And of course, be comfortable working with children, have some education background, et cetera. So
not many people were going to tick all those boxes.
Right. Not many people ticked all the boxes the way I did. So they were like, we need to send you Lisa. They're like, yes, Lisa's perfect. Send her along. But in order to do that, it's not like I could just pop 50 kilos of French chocolate into my suitcase.
Right.
So I partnered with Dandelion in order to run these workshops, and they were very generous. That's why I keep mentioning them, because they have been...
They're lovely.
They're lovely, and they really have been very formative and helpful, knowingly and unknowingly, right? In my whole journey since the beginning of all this, they keep cropping up, right? They were probably the first craft chocolate that I tasted 20 years ago or whatever in San Francisco before this all started. And so they were able to sell me a ridiculous amount of their chocolate to use for teaching with, right? And I borrowed equipment from them. They were very generous. But their chocolate is not meant to be tempered by hand and certainly not meant for molding, because it's exactly what the beans give you, right? And so the flavor profile and the beans that were going to be the least difficult to work with and the most sort of middle of the road tasting wise to be using with the children was their Columbia 70% Tumaco, which I just love. Ironically, I don't love other people's Tumaco. I love their Tumaco. So even chocolate made from beans from the same region, when other people work with it, I'm like, yeah, but no.
Well, it's the same with wine.
Yeah, it's the same with, exactly. So, but that's a whole different tangent. And so I probably saw about 300 students over the course of 4 teaching days and had to give lectures in front of gymnasiums full of 300 kids that had to, give talks and be at culture days and stuff like that. It was very intense. But so for each school that I went into, I would have to go in the day before, plug in the chocolate machine so the chocolate could melt overnight. And I used 2 different machines because for every hour that I had a group of kids, I would temper it and have it ready right before the kids came in. But by the time we got to the end of the class working with it with those kids, it would start to set. And so for the next class that was going to start an hour later, I would have to retemper another batch of chocolate because what I was using in that first class, it's no good anymore. I can't use it.
Right.
I couldn't keep it liquidy enough to work with. It was still in temper, but it was just starting to set on itself.
But what I'm hearing is also that, so Dandelion will work with a chocolate that is not for molds, not for bonbon, that is purely for tablettes, right? Bars.
Yeah.
And then has something different that they work with for their other products.
No,
They don't.
they
Okay.
don't. They're still purists. They're still using 2-ingredient chocolate and giving you the tablet or the chocolate the way that the way the bean intended it. They just have machines to do it.
Oh, I see what you're
Right?
saying. Right. Okay. Yes.
Even in those machines, it can be hard, and they have to really fiddle with the temperature and the timing, and work fast. And like when they're pouring it into the tablets, they have machines that help agitate and shake the mold so that the chocolate gets into every little corner. It's a lot harder to do by hand when you're surrounded by a bunch of 8-year-olds, right?
And is that something that would be the same here with one of the chocolate makers that we know?
Yes. And so that's the other thing that people don't realize, that there are pros and cons, and it's definitely not easy to work with craft chocolate in a pastry setting or whatnot. But like, you and I always talk about plaque and how much.
So when you're saying craft chocolate, you mean bean to bar or not necessarily?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. When I say craft chocolate, I mean bean to bar. And part of what's happening in the industry is people are starting to make a conscious effort to say craft chocolate as opposed to just saying bean to bar, because so many large companies now are capitalizing on this concept and on this catchphrase. And so now you have even enormous industrial chocolate companies who are claiming to be bean to bar. It's like, well, yeah, obviously you're taking beans, but it has nothing to do with the same implication of a craft chocolate maker who is literally flying out to Peru twice a year to meet with their farmers and test the chocolate and develop a relationship, and working with small batches of no more than 65 or 130 kilos of chocolate at a time. Not to mention like small makers like me, I'm working with 2 kilos at a time. That's not the same as like Valrhona claiming to be bean to bar when they're purchasing 5 tons at a time.
Right.
You can't really.
Do you know what this reminds me of?
Yeah.
For my first book, when I had a whole section on beer and craft beer and what constitutes craft or not.
Right.
And the definition is so nebulous, partially because there's no codified rule, but also in the US, when you look at, they've decided that what is craft beer has to do with volume.
Okay.
And by that definition, Samuel Adams is a craft beer, which we know, still, versus just as much as the little small shop, in some small town who's making their own beer. So the problem is when these terms are not regulated, or at least have a parameter that's far too wide, you've got, corporations that, seize those terms, and then it confuses the consumer.
Right. And we have the same, I even got into an argument with my teacher at the IECCT recently.
Which is what, an international...
It sounds great when you say it. You ready? I love saying all the words. The International Institute of Chocolate and Cacao Tasting.
It just rolls right off the tongue.
Just rolls right off the tongue. But that is currently the most sort of standardized sort of regulating body for chocolate tasting certification. So I've done up to level 2 with them, hoping to do level 3 with them in Peru this summer at Origin, finally getting back to Peru, which will be exciting. But yeah, so we had this argument at Chocoa in February about what still counts as craft chocolate. And to me, I have this feeling of like, to me, craft chocolate is a little guy. It's Ara and Lanson Cacao and even Plaque, where they're working in these tiny spaces. They're working with very small quantities. They only have, maybe 2 shops. They have a very controlled production, a couple of machines. But then the problem is, well, you can't fault people for getting successful. So like there's another craft chocolate maker, which, Martin still considers craft. And I'm like, I have a really tough time still calling them craft. And they're in India and they're lovely people, but they're so big now and they're processing tons of chocolate every year, and they have a bunch of shops and different factories, and and they've become a big company. And to me, you can't put them in the same category as like Alistair of the chocolate tree in Scotland, where he's got his modest little factory and he goes to the festivals himself and he's there,
But then is there another term for when you get sort of to a mid-range, like Alain Ducasse, who's obviously a big guy, but didn't
definitely
start
not
that
craft
way
anymore,
no,
right?
Yeah. What do you call them when it's not a bad product? I mean, it might not be the pure form you prefer, but it's arguably not a bad chocolate.
Right.
And it's not a supermarket chocolate, and it's not an industrial chocolate.
Yeah, and
it's
I don't have an answer to that question.
Right. We lack the words.
It's hard because you don't want to start feeling like you're putting people into categories or passing judgment on people, basically faulting them for becoming so successful that they then now have a bigger factory. But for me, I think part of it is really, there's got to be something in there that has to do with how much the original founder and chocolate maker is actually still implicated in the process. And still, if the person who started the company and is the chocolate maker is not in the factory every day, sticking that tasting spoon in and deciding when it's done, that's when it starts to stop really being craft chocolate. When it's so big that they've got a team of so many people and there's chocolate still spinning and other people are roasting for them, other people are doing all the work actually, and they're not really hands-on making their own chocolate anymore.
So that's founder driven then.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is quantity driven, part of it is founder driven. Part of it also has to do with this connection with the supply chain. Like, are you really connected? Are you getting out there and meeting the people supplying and cultivating your beans? Or if you're working with a middleman, do you know who your middleman is? Like if you're working with Kate with Cacao Latitudes and you know that Kate is out there in the fields,
right?
8 months out of 12, meeting with them, overseeing the fermentation processes, creating educational spaces for the people working there, making sure that those people who are harvesting and doing the post-harvest processing, that they're getting paid enough to pay attention to what they're doing properly, and that they're not asking their kids to get pulled out of school to help them in the fields. There's a responsibility, and this is also part of like what makes a craft chocolate and why these are the chocolates that we want to support. There's the social impact and there's the health impact.
Right.
And the social impact is really, really important, that, you want to make sure that you're not
supporting something horrific. I mean, we know that some of the big companies like Nestle, among others, Lindt, which must be owned by Nestle or
definitely
I don't know
on
who.
my
boycott list.
There we go.
I mean, they work
I was
with
going to say something less.
Child labor in Africa and
even the companies that say, "Oh, look," like Tony's, and they say, "Oh, look, we can prove that our chocolate is child labor free," and then you have people out there in the fields, who are basically documenting the fact that the people who signed the papers saying, "Oh, no kids were working here today," they've gone around and like shuttled the kid, like they have a week's notice, and so they're organizing it so that the papers can get signed off. But even still, it's like, okay, fine. You might be able to say that these cacao beans have been farmed more or less ethically, but it's a 60% chocolate bar, and the 40%, the 25% that's sugar that's coming from some crazy farm, some, sugar farm in Brazil or India that's all being run by children. How can you call it child labor free when 30% of the product is actually being created through child labor?
Oof.
So,
No, you bring up a really good point. I forgot about that particular company as an example of how, I mean, God, this sounds so much like fashion and greenwashing.
Exactly.
And and even with coffee, which I talk about so much with my clients and on this show because I love it so much. Coffee and chocolate.
A really great coffee place the other day.
Right. And you want to know that you're not drinking something every single day that is harming people every second of every day. You know? But so you mentioned 3 places, Plaque, which is bean to bar, very pricey, very good, but they're obviously, in 2 very expensive neighborhoods of Paris. They have small shops, a team. L'Instant Cacao. And then the third one you mentioned was
Ara.
Yeah. You told me about that recently.
Yeah.
Are there others that may not fall within that very, very
small bean to bar niche
category that you would be like, you know what, if you're coming to Paris and, these are some of the chocolatiers that I
respect and want to eat. Yeah. I mean, that's a very valid question because, with the exception of Plaque, and this is always, what do you say, the catch-22, even for myself trying to open my own space. The profit, like if you're really doing the good work, creating amazing chocolate from amazing beans, doing it yourself, etc., the margin is minuscule, and you're still working in a very labor-intensive process that takes a lot of time and space and machines, and then you want to be paying a fair price for the beans, making sure you're getting good beans. At the end of the day, that means you can't really afford rent in, you can't be spending 5,000 euros a month on rent if you're going to have a little chocolate shop somewhere in Paris in the middle of the areas where all the tourists get to easily, right? So the people who are doing that work, for the most part, are a little bit on the fringe, right, in terms of where they're located. And your typical food tour through the Marais, you're not going to pass a bean-to-bar chocolatier because a chocolate maker, because no one in their right mind can afford 11,000 euros in rent to do that in the Marais. So,
but there are non-bean-to-bar.
Right. There are non-bean-to-bar places that are definitely delicious and worth going. And I still have a lot of respect for Patrick Roger. I love his chocolate. I've met him a few times. His parcours, as we say in French, his professional trajectory is just so unexpected and incredible that I have a lot of respect for what he's built. And his chocolate has always been so beautiful. And his bonbons have always just been so well balanced, so powerful, so flavor forward.
And he produces his own almonds now.
There you go.
In France,
Amazing.
It doesn't have to come from super far away.
Yeah, so now he's got his own almond farms.
Yep.
That doesn't surprise me at all. But of course, like my, fascination and kind of like, oh, he's the chocolate god, with Patrick Roger started long before this journey. Like when I lived in Zurich and I would come to Paris as a visitor, and I first discovered Patrick Roger, I was just like jaw on the ground because I was an art teacher. And when I saw the big orangutan life-size orangutan head sculpted out of chocolate in the window, I was like, oh my gosh, my dreams come true. And so I had a lot of respect for him as a visual artist as well.
Sure.
And just daring to work with chocolate as a sculpting medium that way, and bringing those two worlds together. But that being said, you put one of his fresh lime salted caramel bonbons in your mouth, and it's just like, explosion, right? So,
which is how I feel about Jacques Genin. We've talked about that.
We've talked about that before, yeah. So Jacques Genin, I also love his chocolate. I would say if I'm going to go visit a shop, I definitely prefer the one on Rue du Bac.
Oh, real? Oh, because of just
because
chaos
of the yeah, you could call it the chaos. I'll just say my experiences as a customer in Rue du Bac have been much more pleasant and welcoming there. So I definitely like that shop. But every time I go to Jacques Genin for chocolate, I get distracted by the pâte à fruits because his pâte à fruits are so amazing.
It's true. There's a lot to look at there.
A lot to look at and a lot of deliciousness there. I'm also still a fan of Jean-Paul Evin.
I knew you were going to go there. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, old school, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. He's another, gonna say it, he's another old white guy, another old French guy, but he's doing good work, and he has started working with them, trying to be a little bit more impliqué, as they say, working with the plantations in Cameroon and trying to, help develop better flavor cacao and help support the communities that are producing the chocolate that he works with. And the boutiques are beautiful.
Sure.
The packaging is beautiful. The flavors are interesting.
And to be honest, if you're someone who likes macaron, you can try his macaron, which I do only with clients who really like macaron.
Yeah.
Because then they can compare it to the ones that everybody else knows.
Right.
And it usually holds up. They're smaller batch,
Yeah. They're much denser, his macaron, but they're obviously very chocolate heavy, which is great. And of course, I love that he's still making pastries with the chocolate, right? And creating those little cakes that are very chocolate forward, very origin forward, like
the potato.
Right, the potato. Still making the potato.
It literally looks like it's called potato and looks like a potato and has, it's dusted chocolate right on top.
It does kind of also look like other things.
Yes, we're not going to name those on here, but you can decide for yourself.
Yeah, I don't buy that one usually with clients, but making the entremet that pairs the Venezuelan chocolate with the tonka and with the one with the raspberry and really showcasing for people who normally wouldn't think about it, even in pastry, the chocolate that you choose, the origin and that particular bean has a specific flavor profile. So the Venezuelan chocolate might pair better with a tonka cream, but then if you are working with the chocolate from Honduras, well, no, we're gonna put a peach compote in there because that's gonna complement it better. Or, like,
Well, and that's where your pastry training comes in quite nicely to complement what you know about chocolate then, to, you know what works texturally, flavor-wise.
Right. And I think that's also one of the biggest things that we're finally, I think, starting to shift the paradigm, right? Shifting the mindset of how people think about chocolate. So Industrial Revolution, when chocolate was finally, able to start being something produced for the masses that could be affordable, not just for the high courts, but also for your everyday people and all that history stuff, which we don't need to talk about. But between the UK and New York and Holland and France, and everybody was kind of in Switzerland, and, all these people were sort of trading around machines, right? And so when you finally started having machines that could help produce chocolate, the chocolate industry joined the Industrial Revolution, meaning the idea was like, oh, cool, wow, we can finally create a consistent product. And so this idea of chocolate having a consistent taste and flavor from batch to batch, from year to year, that was considered a good thing. And so a lot of the products and things that we grew up on, no matter how much the harvest has changed, where they got their beans has changed, nobody ever thought to be suspicious that a Hershey bar still tasted like a Hershey bar 20 years later. And that was because all of these additives or different kinds of vanilla or different kinds of blends where they were reconstructing a specific flavor profile, and then also going into, and this starts to get into genetics, but, pushing these plantations to sort of overstrip the soil, replanting and cloning and in a monoculture to get that CCN 51 flavor, because that's what, entre guillemets, that's what chocolate tastes like, right? And that's what people want, because that's what people get used to. Of what does chocolate taste like? This is chocolatey, right? But that was just one or two specific genetic profiles of specific cocoa beans that had been cultivated for productivity and yield, and not necessarily for fine flavor, because, we'll just fix it in post. Right? We're going to add chemicals, sugars, vanilla, whatever, to create that chocolatey flavor. And so we started to really lose all of this incredibly rich biodiversity possible, of the, tens of thousands of different genetic profiles that you can have in chocolate that give it different flavors. So what that meant was that the chocolate people were using to bake with and to make other things, and to make a chocolate mousse and to make a chocolate cake or to make your chocolate chip cookies, it was that specific chocolate flavor, right? So it meant that when chefs were developing recipes, bringing lots of ingredients together, whether it was raspberries or this certain kind of cream or a mole sauce or whatever it was, they only had one, they had blinders on. Well, this is what chocolate tastes like. And then they would explore, if they're making a truffle pasta, they might go and taste 25 different types of truffle mushrooms to get just exactly the flavor they want for their pasta sauce. But if they're making a dessert, they'd be like, well, chocolate is chocolate, which is totally BS.
Yeah.
So what that meant was that those dessert recipes were built around chocolate only having one flavor.
Right.
Right. And now we know, and now we've relearned, right? We've unlearned and relearned. There is such a huge variety of flavor that you can get out of chocolate. Different cocoa beans from different plantations, from different altitudes, from different parts of the world, fermented differently, processed differently. All of those things affect the final flavor. And then you should be building the dessert recipe around that, not the other way around.
Right.
And so...
Super interesting.
Yeah. So you take the flavor that's present in the chocolate itself, and then you showcase it by building something around it, not the other way around.
So let me know, is this something like what you talk about in your workshops? Because that was the other point I wanted to make sure listeners take away from this is that you lead workshops, chocolate tours, and you're an educator, writ large on the subject of chocolate. So is this something that you find people want to know about?
Well, they're going to learn it anyway.
As they should. That's a good strategy, actually.
So yeah, I mean, obviously coming from a background of 20 years as an educator, no matter what I've done in my life, whether it was dancing or painting or whatever, I'm more interested in teaching people how to do it and appreciate it than having people appreciate what I do. I'm not as interested in making my own chocolate and selling it and having people say oh, look, she knows how to make really good chocolate. That interests me way less than being able to teach tens of thousands of people over the course of time how to appreciate better chocolate and buy different better chocolate and use different better chocolate in their own baking and being able to support this wider network.
Well, chocolate fans, you've heard it all here first. Lisa, I'm sure you'll be back again. Thank you so much.
With pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's the show for today. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to check out the poll related to this episode by scrolling down in your app. There are more exciting conversations to come this season, so I hope you'll subscribe or share the show with a friend if you've been enjoying what you've heard so far. As always, you can find more from me at lindsaytremuta.com and at the New Paris Dispatch on Substack. À très bientôt.